Hey guys, it's Gary again. Back on this Thanksgiving Day evening, um, doing something quite a bit different. I felt like chatting. Been home all day. Decided to do a bit of a personal update. Not too much, actually. You can put your pens and pencils away. I'm not doing any music history review kind of things. I just thought I'd give you maybe a little bit update what's going on with me. Not for any good reason, actually. First, start with some stuff I've been listening to, because I just figured I would include that in here. I've showed all these before, and I mentioned I had the last time I was unemployed, which was about 1982 or 3. For some reason, I got into this is long before CDs, obviously. A few years before CDs. I got into a Buddy Rich mode. And after I started working again, oddly enough, I stopped listening to Buddy Rich. I didn't stop listening to music. Stopped listening to Buddy Rich. A few months ago, I think I mentioned this, I got into a Buddy Rich mode again. So I pulled out all my old albums, the vinyl that I had, and started listening again. These are reissues. The first two I showed were compilations. Here's a reissue, Pacific Jazz. I like the label and I like the idea, but just to show you how cheap they were, this is an album called Big Swing Face from the late 60s. And a completely different album, reissued also. Same exact cover. Got to read the title, Swingin' New Band, and this is also from the 60s. Doesn't make much sense. You flip through these in a rack and they look like the same album, and it's not. It's two separate albums. It's kind of weird. Kind of weird how they... it's a nice cover image, but to use the same cover image without altering it at all. So I pulled out my vinyl. I've started listening to a lot of Buddy Rich, and I also bought about, which I shouldn't be doing, I bought about half a dozen CDs of his as well. Most of the CDs I bought were the original albums. The first two I showed are compilations, and I got that material that I had on album. The records were skipping, unfortunately, and even though they were well cared for. And I wanted some of that material, so I used Discogs, which is a great source, really. And new to me, I only discovered Discogs a few months ago. And I went there to try to figure out, because they don't mention on those albums what the first two that I showed, what albums the material was taken from. And they were mid-70s albums from 73, 74. And I was able to track down the few albums. It's 3 or 4 albums the material was taken from. And I actually bought those on CD. Don't know, I'm not a big band fan. Just something I like about that period, and I bought the Compact Jazz Buddy Rich thing, which goes back to much earlier 50s stuff, mainly because I'm a fan of the Compact Jazz series. On that note, I've acquired another Compact Jazz one, Louis Armstrong, except for this one I'm not keeping. I actually saw that the Compact Jazz series, which I'm in love with this particular, I don't know why, I think it's a nostalgic thing. When CDs first came around, before all of the old back Verve catalog was available on CD of all the old jazz artists that they had, there's a lot of stuff. All of a sudden, here you are, the late 80s, CDs come along and all the new albums have to come out on CD, and there's tons and tons and tons of old things that the factories are just, they're just waiting in line to put these old albums on CD. So Verve put out these, I think these were the first compilations that Verve did, and Verve has continued to this day to make just an unnecessary amount of compilations of their artists. But at the time these came out in the late 80s, most of the albums they were drawn from weren't available separately and completely on CD. So, and I remember seeing these in Iraq and thinking, oh, it's like a compact discs were new. And I'm not particularly into Louis Armstrong. It's a little bit before my time. I actually bought this. I got a good deal on it. It's still sealed, still new. And my dad, who's going to, I think, turn 90 next year, bought a new car recently. And I don't know if he has a CD player in it, but I'm hoping he does. Because I had my sister ask him when she was talking to him, do you have a CD player? He doesn't know because he doesn't know anything about CDs. He doesn't have any. I'm assuming because he bought a new car that he has a CD player in there, so I'm taking a chance. I'm going to throw this at him for Christmas, and I'll show him how to use it. I mean, it's not too difficult. But this will be his first CD. Assuming he has one in his car, that is. And I've been listening to a lot of this guy, David Friesen. This is the only album by him that I have on vinyl. And an interesting guy, plays an upright bass, this ancient upright bass. Gets a fantastic sound. I believe he lives in Oregon because most of his albums are recorded in that general area. And he's the kind of guy that I could easily have seen with the kind of music he does. I could see him on ECM in the 70s. He's recorded a lot, and his albums vary according to the setting. I bought this one, obviously in the vinyl age, before CDs came around. $4.99 for a new album. Unbelievable. It wasn't even a clearance thing. This is how long ago I bought this. I bought it because at the time I was probably playing in essentially a duo. And I was interested in duo albums, especially. And I was primarily playing guitar, and my partner was playing bass. My musical partner that I had at the time was playing bass. So I was always interested in duo albums, and this one is particularly a great album, which this is on my Christmas wish list to get on CD. Other Mansions. It's nice. They play other instruments on here. Some of the tracks are live, and there's some overdubbing on here. I highly recommend it. I'm going to do... I have about a half a dozen CDs on David Friesen, and his stuff is so varied, depending on the musical setting. He has a solo bass album, which I have. And he's got a couple of mainstream things that he played with, a very interesting album where he played with Bud Shank on saxophone, Dave Friesen on bass, and Clark Terry on trumpet. That's it. Bass, trumpet, and saxophone. No drums, no piano. They play a lot of standards on there, but it's really pretty, even if you don't like mainstream jazz. That kind of chamberish lineup, when it comes to playing standards, it's really, really, really interesting. His other stuff ranges from things where he even, on occasion, I think there's even not a lot, but a couple albums where there's some synthesizer going on. I think even a drum machine. I know he uses Erdo Morera on some of his albums. So he has things done with small 4 or 5 piece bands, solo albums, duo albums. He's done another album which I don't have with his guitarist John Stowell, who I was not familiar with prior to hearing this. I haven't heard that one. I don't have that one, but I like this. It's because it's not just bass and guitar. It's they play the guitarist John Stowell plays mandolin, some percussion. Dave Friesen plays some tabla on here. He plays some piano. Like they both play a little bit of hand percussion. Dave Friesen also plays some flute on here. So some tracks are live. Some tracks are like live in the studio. But this is really good. I got to get this on CD because playing the vinyl on my turntable, which is breaking down, is bad news basically, and it depresses me. So, and that one is readily available on CD, thankfully. What else is going on with me? Not that you would care. I did something I haven't done for years, since I've been recording and playing quite a bit more in the last few months. I actually changed the strings on my acoustic steel string guitar, where I've not changed the strings. Well, I've been here almost 3 years in this condo. I didn't change the strings before then. It's probably had the same strings on there for 5 or 6 or 7 or more years. So I actually bought a new set of steel strings one day when I really had nothing to do, and I changed them. And the thing I hate changing strings, but the thing that I really hate about it is how they're out of tune. And I was amazed, they didn't really go out of tune much. I've been recording something on the acoustic guitar, a piece that I have the basic tracks down for, and I'm having trouble with the stuff that goes over it, the lead lines that go over it. So I was kind of frustrated, and I haven't finished that piece. But I also got an idea to maybe put some acoustic slide guitar on there, and instead of just playing individual like solos over the bed that I've gotten created on the acoustic guitars. And I discovered, and this is an ongoing discovery. I've been here 3 years, but I'm still discovering stuff that I left at my old home, which is demolished and sold. And one of the things that I thought I had packed, but apparently I didn't. I left a lot of stuff. I left albums that I'm very upset that I left. Those are the things that slowly are unfolding that I'm finding out about. One of the other things that I left that's kind of upsetting to me is some guitars, some instrument stuff, and a good old guitar slide, which thankfully are very cheap, is one of the things I left behind. So I ordered this. I think it was $4 or $5 for guitar slide. I can't believe I didn't take that though. I have a couple storage music, cases full of loose stuff. And I thought I had grabbed all my loosies, all the little loose things like guitar slides and things, little cables and things like that. And I guess not, because I couldn't find it. So thankfully, they can be had quite cheaply. So I bought a guitar slide, bought some new strings. All in all, probably cost me less than $10 for both, which is good because I don't have it. What else? Well, still in the recording stage, I have been recording my next thing, CD, album, whatever you want to call it, for some time now. And as I've gone along, I wouldn't say the concept, if there is one, hasn't really changed, but what pieces are going on there have changed. I started off, it's the first time ever in my life that I've used any kind of recording software. And I've talked about this, I think, earlier in my earlier videos. And I quickly discovered you could do things with virtual instruments, which means I don't have to play, but all the notes have to be entered on the staff. And so I decided I wanted to create something using, it's not classical music, but using orchestral sounds. Obviously instruments that I'm not playing and can't play, like flutes and cellos. And I wanted to limit the piece to strictly orchestral sounds. I didn't want to mix in, synthesizers and guitars and things that I actually play. I wanted it to be solely orchestral. And, I have had this concept for this, fairly long 30-minute piece or so. I probably got 20 minutes of it done, but I put it aside because it's painstakingly tedious and very long. If you could play these things, it would be preferable to play them, because it's so much longer putting the notes kind of, not exactly on the staff, but let's call it on the staff. And the great thing with that is you can move things around. If I don't like it in this measure, I want it to go in that measure, you can just slide it along, which you can't do with really recorded music. But just to play a 3-note phrase or something like that takes a hell of a lot longer than it does just to play the phrase, if you were to actually play that instrument. So I put the, I'll call classical thing aside for a future project, so that it doesn't get rushed just so it can get completed, but rather so the whole thing is worth listening to. And I started recording, some individual pieces. And I did do a couple things using the virtual instruments. This time not playing classical instruments, but actually pretty much using synthesizer sounds. And I tell you, once this album comes out with these particular tracks where I use virtual instruments, replicating synthesizers, I won't be doing that again, I'll tell you that. Since I can play synthesizers, to some extent anyway, I am not going to use virtual software to create anything that are instruments that I can play. Now, having said that, there are certain technical sections in this thing that I'm writing that involve a keyboard technique that I don't have. So there's a couple times when there's some fast synthesizer keyboard runs that I couldn't play because I'm not really a keyboard player. So there's that aspect of it. But I think I'm going to keep my virtual instruments because it's so incredibly time-consuming to do things like the classical piece that is simply creating pieces on instruments like cellos and flutes, maybe horns, things that I can't play myself, and not really use virtual instruments to create synthesizers and things like that. Having said that, I have, I guess, about 2 pieces that sound like they're regular synthesizers, but are actually virtual instruments that are completed. I have the beginning and the ending piece on the album I've actually put up months ago. Well, there's an opening that just involves some drums and an ocarina, the little wind instrument that you play. That's like a 85-second introduction that I put up months and months ago. And the very last piece on the album I put up about a month ago, which is just a synthesizer piece where I actually play the synthesizer myself. And that was an improvisation that I did off the cuff. And I liked it so much, I listened to it for quite a few days and decided that it was good enough to put on a recording. It caught a mood, and it was done live in the studio, in my garage studio. And I decided not to overdo it by overdubbing additional stuff on top, which I could have done. Now that's a lesson that I'm learning. That's very hard because nowadays, especially when you're dealing with music software, you could have 50 instruments on there, and it's so tempting to just fill up all the sound because you can. Oh, let me see what it would sound like if I put this and that on there. And you end up with way too much going on sometimes. And sometimes too, and yet, when I'm listening to other artists do things, I appreciate a lot of the minimal aspects of music when everything is not so busy and so full and there's a million things going on. A good example of somebody who does that maybe Brian Eno's ambient music. There's not necessarily the sense that I've got to overdub 50 synthesizer parts here, or even a lot of Harold Budd stuff, especially solo stuff that he plays by himself. He doesn't necessarily go for the too much overdubbing. There's a sense of space in the music there. And I've been listening to a couple obscure electronic artists in recent times. Hiroshi Yoshimura, which is one of them, who has an album called Green, which came out about 1986 on Sonia Gaia, I think it was. I think it's the only thing of his that came out in the U.S., but apparently he's got a whole bunch of releases out. And the thing that always struck me about this album, Green, which is long out of print, is how much space there is in there. And I was surprised when I bought it that he didn't overdub a lot more, because done in the studio, it was all synthesizers, and it took me years to really understand what he was going for. I didn't know anything about him, and then recently I looked him up on the internet, and I found out that, when he passed away, of course, and that he's got quite a few releases out, but he was fairly highly thought of in certain circles, certainly in Japan, where he's from. And apparently he did quite a lot of this really, really minimal. They talk about minimal music, and they talk about, in general, about things where there's not a lot of necessary harmonic movement going on. But in his case, his music was really minimal in the case that it wasn't an instrumentally full, busy thing like you would hear in a Terry Riley or Philip Glass or Steve Riker, those kind of minimalistic things. There's a lot of quiet in there. So I did this 9-minute synthesizer improvisation one day live in my studio, just messing around, not even attempting to do anything live or anything permanent. And it came out really good, and I listened to it, and I said, this is good enough, and it sounds like a good ending piece for the album. And I did that, and I had started, as I mentioned earlier, writing this acoustic guitar piece, which is a lot of overdubbed acoustic guitars, and I got the bass part of it down, the basic lay tracks, whatever you want to call them, and really just have to put the solo stuff over it and the lead stuff over it, and I was struggling, having so much trouble with it. And then one day I just picked up my nylon string guitar, and I was not attempting to make a finished piece, but I did record it. I was smart. I recorded it live, and I went on for 6 or 7 minutes, and I thought it came out pretty good, and I listened to it. There's a whole bunch of mistakes and everything in there. But because I had recorded it into the software, as opposed to just recording it onto a hard drive, which is my whole CD Impressions of a Year was done on a hard drive. So if there was a mistake with a note, I had no way of editing it out. This time when I was just improvising, I think I barely woke up when I did this too. I was very relaxed playing this classical guitar little improvisation that I recorded, and I had a feeling, because I was having so much trouble working on this other acoustic guitar piece, and I was tensing up and stressing, and every time I tried to record even a few seconds of the solo stuff that goes on top, nothing was working, and I gave up on it. That piece will be on a future album someday. It will get done, no doubt about it. But then one day I just had this desire just to play the nylon string, and I picked up the nylon string and I turned on the software and I improvised, and I was really liked what came out, so I recorded it. I listened back to it, but there's a whole crap load of mistakes in there. Thankfully, because I had recorded it into the software, you could edit out the mistakes. Just boom, take this note out. Or actually do a fade out of the one bad note that you played, so that you've got a proper note, bad note, proper note, and you can actually just edit out that bad note. And this thing that took me like 7 minutes to record, I easily spent an entire week editing out the bad notes. So there's quite a few. But also, one thing that I noticed, and I don't know if you're going to be able to hear this. The nylon string guitar is a very quiet instrument. So when you're playing it into a microphone or anything that picks it up, one of the things, unfortunately, that comes out very loud is the sliding of the fingers. So I was doing this thing where I'd play this, and I don't know how much you're going to be able to hear that, but then you'll slide to another chord or another note or something, and you get, I think you'd hear that. Hear that sliding, that loud sliding. Well, that sliding pretty much almost ruined the piece because it was so loud, because the volume of the nylon string guitar is so low. It doesn't project like a steel string acoustic or an electric guitar does. And, you'd hear this nice, pretty, soft, mellow chord or series of notes or something like that. And then you would hear this slide, that would kind of ruin the vibe and mood. So I decided, I took out some of the wrong notes. Actually, some of the wrong notes I left in because it ended up sounding intentional and composed. So it was quite a surprise. I had to take out all those slides because that sliding sound was ruining the piece. And it ended up taking me a lot of time to do that. I did do it, though. And I also decided, wow, this is really good enough. I'm putting it on my CD. And it's this another piece, the second piece, that's essentially a live piece. I didn't, like I said, I did take out, it might not be live in the sense that, yes, I did remove bad notes. I lowered the volume of those slides. But I didn't overdub any additional instruments. And I didn't take any sections from it, which I was tempted to do, and copy them like you would, I don't know, like a Word document or something. And copy them and have them repeat, if you know what I mean. It's like if you hear this really good phrase but you only played it once, you could take that phrase, copy it, and then have it repeat as many times as you want. I didn't do any of that, or get a whole bunch of different sections in there, a whole bunch of different chord changes or note sequences or whatever. And you could say, well, gee, this part D here sounds better if I put it between A and B than leaving it by D. So you could kind of copy a section, take it out, and put it in someplace else in the composition. I didn't do any of that. So for that reason, I wasn't sure whether or not I didn't do any of that. I left it. This is the order I played everything in. I don't know whether I can consider it live or not. I should leave that up to musicians. I might end up asking Ron Anderson what his opinion is. Could I consider that a live in the studio recording or not? Because I did edit out bad notes, and I did take out or reduce the volume of those slides that you heard, transitioning from one part of the neck to another. But I didn't rearrange any of the music that was played, but I did take out the bum notes. And what I didn't do is I didn't overdub any additional parts on there. So I'm learning. I like the vibe it got, and I like the quiet nature. And it's really, when you hear it in the context of, because most of the rest of the album is highly electronic, when you hear that piece in between two electronic pieces, it really brings the point home. So I've got, depending on how you count these things, maybe 5 out of 6 pieces done. Unfortunately, when you're doing these things, you tend to leave the harder work for last. And the thing that I have problems with is I'm going to have an epic piece on there that goes anywhere from 15 to 20 to 25 minutes, whatever. And stupid me, I shouldn't have done this. When I started doing it, I decided, it was going to be a keyboard sounding thing, an electronic keyboard sounding thing. But I was writing it in the software in the virtual instruments instead of playing them live myself. That was a mistake, because as a result, it's taking me, I started on this 2 months ago probably, and I'm nowhere with it. Because every single note has to be punched in and moved. And it's really taking a lot longer than if I had just played it. But there's also some things, as I mentioned before, that I can't physically play. There's some very fast little keyboard runs in there that I couldn't replicate. And I put so much work into it now, honestly, I don't want to. I'd have to go figure out every single thing that I played on there again in order to actually go and play it on the keyboard. And the sounds that I have available on my synthesizers are different than the ones in the virtual software. And what I was going for in the virtual software was a lot of, without sounding too retro, I was really looking for a lot of analog synthesizer sounds without attempting to just sound like a piece that came out of the 70s. I just chose electronic keyboard sounds that I liked. A lot of them, as it turns out, which I knew, turn out to be things from the 70s analog synthesizer era. I like the warmth of that sound. I don't like the 80s synthesizer sounds at all. And afterwards, synth sounds now are whatever they are. The samples are so good they sound like acoustic instruments if that's what they attempt to do. So a string section now sounds like a string section from an orchestra if that's what they intended. Back in the 70s, they couldn't really replicate that. So they created these synthetic textures, which to me have a validity on their own. They don't sound like really a string section of an orchestra. You would never mistake it for a string section of an orchestra. but it's got its own value, I think, and its own qualities and timbres and everything. So I started creating this semi-masterpiece. This is the big piece on the album, the big long piece on the album. And I started that a long time ago, and since then I've recorded other pieces, like the 2 live. I mean, it's really weird. I'm going to have 2 live things on there, essentially. This 9-minute keyboard thing I did in my garage that one day in my studio, that was just really meant to be me farting around on the keyboard, and really came out well. And this classical guitar thing, which I'm really, 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 really happy with. And I avoided the temptation to overdo it by overdubbing crap on top of it. But this more epic piece is really giving me a problem. So unless I end up shortening it from, originally I envisioned it to 30 minutes, and then I started cutting it back, I could publish it probably tomorrow if I decided I only wanted it to be 5 minutes, but that's kind of not what I wanted. I want, one of those long pieces that, are reminiscent of things that you could just lay back and lose track of time and get lost in, and that, really, say, develop over time, but really, sometimes I don't want them to develop. I just want them to be long enough so that you kind of get lost and you can shift your listening attention from one thing, one part going on to another part going on, and you need longer pieces to do that with. And everything else on the album is, short, there's 8-9 minute pieces, but there's also, a couple 5-minute pieces, 5 or 6 minutes. What else? That's the update on the album. I'll give you plenty of advance notice when it gets closer to. And I really, it's been a week since I even plugged in a single note in there in that epic piece, because it's such a nightmare. Finally, a couple nights ago, I added a couple lines, which 5-6 seconds, not even. So I have a concept for it, but the work involved is just really intense. And I would like to, I kind of initially wanted to put it out January 1st. I would like to start off the new year with it out. And it seemed like it would definitely be done way before then. But now I realize, well, November's almost over, which gives me a month. So I really got to get on it. But, and for most of you folks out there, that have heard the Impression CD, it's new to you, but that thing was put out 4 years ago. So I haven't done anything for 4 years. Haven't put anything out there for 4 years. So, I just would really like to put something out soon. I'm not going to put it out for the sake of having it out there, though. It's going to be complete, and I'm going to be happy with it. The only other thing that's going on with me that I've done, which was last night, which was, ever since I started YouTube, I'm not going to blame YouTube entirely, but since I started doing the YouTube videos and I've started having some, nice interaction with a whole bunch of the people in the VC, and as a result of the videos and the people I've met, I haven't been reading books at all. And I'm not going to blame YouTube on that because I've been on YouTube for less than a year. But I'm going to blame the internet in general, or at least YouTube, my discovery of YouTube when I started watching videos from the VC, especially before I started making them. And just email and internet searches and reading stuff on the internet. And, throughout the years, I kind of stopped reading a few years ago, to be honest with you. I bring books with me when I'm stuck in places sometimes in hopes of starting to read. And I generally start, but get maybe 2 pages into it before I get distracted. I've had to go over my sister's house some days when she was at work because she has work getting done on her house. And I have to let the guys in, the electrician and all that kind of crap. So I've been attempting to bring books there to read because I keep buying books. I haven't stopped buying them over the course of the years just because I stopped reading. So I have this huge stack of books that I haven't read. And my hours are just so messed up now. I've basically been sleeping all day and I've been up all night. And I'm trying to get back onto a more reasonable schedule. So I was laying in bed last night for about 3 hours trying to get to sleep. And I finally gave up at about 2 in the morning or so. and I pulled out my book that I have, which is the Warren Zevon story, as done by his ex-wife. Pretty thick book. I've said before, I pretty much read biographies on musicians, and that's about it. Biographies or autobiographies. I'm not a Warren Zevon fan. I don't actually have any of his albums. But I like reading musical things. Any kind of histories of musicians. And the only ones I don't read is, I have no interest in the guys that are so rich they don't have to work anymore, so the Rolling Stones guys, well, Keith Richards would probably be interesting, to be honest with you, but like the guys from the Beatles, or these guys that don't have to get out of bed anymore for the rest of their lives because they're multimillionaires and their records have made them that way and they don't need to work anymore. I prefer jazz musicians first, but I have got just about every book written about jazz musicians that there is. And the one you can't beat is Art Pepper's Straight Life, which is autobiography, which is my favorite book ever of all time, which I've reread probably the whole thing through 3 times, but I've reread sections of it dozens of times. I have favorite sections of that book. I've read it so much, and sometimes I would go back and just read certain sections. So of all the guys that I've read history biography type things on, he's probably the richest guy. He's made a nice living out of writing some hit songs, and in some cases I think for other people. But he had an interesting life. He wasn't so filthy rich that, he didn't live in a mansion. Apparently his last home was an apartment that he rented, which was surprising to me. He did do live performances, and I think possibly because he still had to work to get an income in the later years, probably from say the late 80s on. But he's passed away, and he had an interesting life nonetheless. And when he was young, oddly enough, I didn't know the time frame of the classical composer Stravinsky, and I'm always thinking of Stravinsky as some guy that lived a couple hundred years ago or 100 years ago. But Warren Zevon actually, as a young man, went over to Stravinsky's house a bunch of times and hung out with him, the composer. So it was a big influence on him. That was pretty interesting to find out. And I only know Warren Zevon from Excitable Boy and Werewolves of London, which are silly songs, but apparently it's not really a good indication of what he was about. And since then I've seen some printed lyrics and heard a couple songs that were quite more substantial than that, not silly things. I wouldn't say I've become a fan at all of his music, but it's an interesting book, and I read slow, and I read a bunch of it last night. It's a very, very, very thick book, and being that he's gone, and it's not a dirt dishing thing so much. It was written by his ex-wife, but they remained friends, and he actually requested to her that he do it. He said, be honest, write my life story, put in the ugly stuff and whatever, which I really appreciate. So, and a lot of interviews with his musical associates and friends and things like that. So I just got started. It started with him dying, basically, the last couple days of his life, and goes back. And it looks like it's going to be an interesting story, about getting his start in the business, and the tales of debauchery and all that kind of thing, like you would expect from a rock guy in the 70s, largely. Okay, and you know what? I got to say, it's been, after I read this for a couple hours, I still had my computer on just in case somebody sent me an email or something. But I got to tell you, it felt really good. It felt like, wow, I haven't done this for a long time. Imagine, which I couldn't, but imagine if, for a couple years you weren't able to sit down and really listen to music and not do anything else, just put on an album and get lost. And it kind of felt like that in a way, how much I enjoyed the act of, reading at your own speed, but also if something is particularly interesting, I tend to go over and read it again. Which is, something that's fairly unique to reading books, as opposed to watching something on TV, maybe. But yeah, I really miss doing this. So I'm gonna, it'd probably be the late night hours when I continue to do it. It's rather hard to do it when the sun's out there bursting through the windows for whatever reason. Wow, 40 minutes. That's an update. I wanted to do an update for whatever reason, I don't know. I hope everybody had a nice Thanksgiving. Probably, for you Americans anyway, out there. And I'll be back with some music stuff, and maybe I'll do some updates too, but they'll be shorter. And I hope everybody's having a great week, and the weekend's upon us fairly soon as well. Take care, and I'll be back soon.